What they needed or wanted yesterday no longer mattered. It was huge, and it stumbled in darkness from Sears. It was Kenmore. Its porcelain and chrome immediately subjugated them. Jets and shelves. They were not materialists and preferred not to dwell on something so large. The house went on quietly nudging the grass as if nothing had happened. I've seen people carried away, sucked into heavy doors without a sound. And yet it wasn't their fault. They had not actually wanted what they got. The uncertain bounds of their desire, together with their incomes, their memories and fears of failure, took away their judgment. They were vulnerable to large crates. They struggled to remove hands from pockets and to hold out credit cards, knowing they paid for passage in the wrong direction. But it was compensation for so many things that they felt mild hysteria as they signed. Compensation. As shadows compensate for Earth's exposure to a sun that goes on imposing itself, delivering unbearable light.
That was Ben Saltman. What was the name of that, Ben?
The Purchase.
The Purchase. Okay, Jodi?
All right, this next poem reflects something that I spend an awful lot of my time doing, which is working with horses. I ride and teach students and train horses. And this one is called Death of a Horse. The acacia is heavy with blossom as they put the old horse down. Yellow flowers smelling of damp ground, sunlight hanging in gray leaves. He shakes bees from the petals falling, his legs galloping through blue sky. Even when the rest of him is still, his nostrils fill with warm air, eyelids open and shut like wings. He has cancer. Each day for 2 years, his throat latch tumor fattened, catching the stomach tube at worming, then his hay. They chopped alfalfa, mixed in molasses. Lately, each breath whistled. They dreamed of his lifting ribs. Now, the needle in his vein, his whole body fills like a lung, then empties. His hooves draw furrows in the dirt as they drag him into the truck. Bees settle again on thin wings in the earth-scented flowers, in the flower-scented earth.
That's lovely. Ben, you and I have something in common. We have a lot of things in common, but one specific thing in common, in that we both came to poetry rather late. I see your first book was published after you were 40. And I didn't start writing poetry seriously until I was in my very late 30s. What happened? How come you stopped writing short stories? How did you get interested in poetry? Tell us about that.
Well, I had written some poetry before that time, but when I went to Claremont Graduate School to work on a PhD, I met Bert Myers, who was also going there. And Myers was just a marvelous person. I think maybe some of the people listening know his poetry and know that he's one of the great poets that has come out of Los Angeles. Bert had such an intense love of poetry that he and I seemed to be able to find someone who could understand the things that I was doing. And he shared the things that he was doing with me. And we sort of, worked together right from the start. He'd already published a book called Early Rain with the Swallow Press, that was then in Chicago. And he was on his way toward publishing a few more books. And his attitudes toward language, his sense of the importance of poetry, that's one of the things that bothers me about Los Angeles. I don't know if it's really, maybe it's just my own projection, but I have felt that people don't believe that poetry is important. They believe that it's sort of fun, but they don't have the kind of conviction that a guy like Bert has, or had. He's dead now, and that poets have. And they just don't take it seriously in that atmosphere, that poetry is some kind of nothing.
Yeah, well, it's not just in Los Angeles, unfortunately.
Well, maybe
sort
not.
of a Western problem.
Do you think that maybe our proximity to Hollywood here might contribute to that? I mean, you're sort of caught between Disneyland and Hollywood, and there seems to be an overwhelming superficiality to almost everything that you come across. I mean, that's Los Angeles has been long noted as Lotus Land, and it has a very glossy surface and a swift undertow. Do you think that might contribute to the attitude?
Yeah, because I spent time in San Francisco. I was there for 2 years, and it was very alive to me, with a sense of the importance of poetry and of literature, of writing, of the literary life. When I say that, I don't mean anything fancy. I mean just the fact that you believe that writing something is a very important thing to do, and that it is important as buying stock.
Well,
it's really important.
We have talked many times on this program about, especially when we have a poet like Bobby Sykes on, we had a couple of weeks ago on tape, who is a poet whose work is very deeply involved with her political activity, for example, and Dennis Brutus, who's going to be on tape in 2 weeks. These are poets who are, I think, in some ways extreme examples, but they're good examples of poets from other parts of the world where poetry is an integral part of a society, where poets are jailed for their words, where poets are taken so seriously that they're killed.
In other words, where the language still has a power.
Exactly.
And where when you do something...
that doesn't happen here.
You might, a poem being published, and I think that's true in most countries, even in Russia, that's still true, where poets become exiled, or poets are forced into exile, because their words have the power to move people to action. And it seems like here you're
floating around,
confronting a monumental indifference. Now,
it doesn't follow, it doesn't follow that poetry must be political, or that you have to write poetry that will cause a riot or anything like that. It's just as important, as Pound said in some of his writings, of all people, but he was very good on this, is that the poet in some ways is the custodian of language, that language matters, and that careful use of language matters. We hear so many poor uses of language constantly in advertising, in politics, etc., lying use of language, abstract use of language, phony use of language, all this, that the poet has a very great responsibility in our society, and it is a political level in another sense of politics, in the sense that the poet cares about how language is used, and etc. So this just doesn't happen.
In short, Ben, do you think that
all a question, right?
Poetry can counteract nuclear war? That's
Well,
in 25 words or less.
When somebody can be thrown in jail in this country for writing a poem, then I'll believe that it might.
Doesn't happen often.
But that's one reason why the poets that I like Attila Joseph and Mandelstam, poets from Europe that for whom a poem was a political statement. To say that it's more than that. To say
it's not propaganda.
Everything important is a political statement.
It's organic. It comes. It's organic, and it's not a superficiality or an artificial.
That's
kind
right.
of thing.
I think of my poetry as having a political content, though it doesn't show it, and I don't have catchphrases.
You're not rhetorical.
I don't say "running dog of the capitalist system."
Right.
If you read between the lines, though, it's in there. We got away from a little bit, although interestingly, but we got away from the question of why did you start writing more poems and stop writing stories? I mean, because the stories are also an expression.
Somebody can be thrown in jail in this country for writing a poem, then I'll believe that it might.
Doesn't happen often.
But that's one reason why the poets that I like Attila Joseph and Mandelstam, poets from Europe that for whom a poem was a political statement. To say that, it's more than that. To say it,
it's not propaganda.
Everything important
in other words,
is a political
it's organic.
statement.
It's organic. It comes. It's organic, and it's not a superficiality or an artificial.
That's
kind of
right.
thing.
I think of my poetry as having a political content, though it doesn't show it. And I don't have catchphrases.
You're not rhetorical. You're not
I don't say "running dog of a capitalist."
Right.
If you read between the lines, though, it's in there. We got away from a little bit, although interestingly, but we got away from the question of why did you start writing more poems and stop writing stories? I mean, because stories are also an expression. I mean, what happened?
Well, I guess it's because it seemed more natural to me. I can't explain it any better than that, really. In fact, that's what I really want to do. I mean, that's what I do, and that's what I really always wanted to do. I think it's associated with that belief in language. I think that no matter how marvelous you write prose or fiction, you have to have your mind on the narrative. You have to have your mind on the dramatic action,
plot,
character,
whole thing.
But you're not thinking of you can't devote yourself to that breakthrough which words themselves are. And maybe
there are story writers who do, but they're more like prose poets.
They're better than I am. I couldn't do it in stories. I had to turn to poetry to.
You found the idea of plot getting in the way.
Find a way of saying the things that mattered.
I see.
Right.
Now I've got to ask Jodi the same question. Right. Do you think poetry can counteract nuclear war? Representing the younger generation coming along here.
I don't know. I think maybe I should sidestep the question too.
Okay, all right.
Just go.
Yeah, right. I don't know. I think that the two, in a way, are maybe sort of opposed to each other in such a way that I don't know whether one, is going to outdo or whatever. In other words, I guess I'm trying to say that I think as long as you have a sort of creative source coming to act in balance with whatever destructive force there is in people also.
Good answer.
Then at least there's something positive to be had.
Very good answer.
There's hope for the human race.
Ben, what did you mean by and then we'll have some more poetry, because I told you we could start talking and you're not going to get too many poems read. Also, I want to identify us. We are KPFK in Los Angeles, and this is the Poetry Connection. I'm Austin Strauss, and this is Wanda Coleman. Our guests tonight are Ben Saltman, who teaches English at Cal State Northridge, and one of his many students, Jodi Johnson. What did you mean when you said, Ben, that there is a political dimension in your work? Because reading your poetry, I understand, I think, what you're saying, but could you explain it a little more? Reading your poetry, there's no overt politics in it at all. So,
well, I think that when a poem deals with reality and deals with oppression. See, oppression is the oppression of the mind as well as of the body. And I think a poet can deal with oppression of the mind. And I think what a poem tries to do is to free the mind, to show what that kind of oppression is. I have a poem. I happen to have a poem.
Okay.
Called The Russian Movie, which it has a little more obvious political qualities, but to someone who read it, he might say, well, this isn't a political poem at all, though it...
Well, read it and then we'll talk about it.
Let me read it. Okay. The Russian Movie. He remembers a white sky, snow, and a forest of birches. Cold and sadness mixed. He can taste the snow. The scene is beautiful, though it smells like an old theater, a comfort he never wanted to leave. The bitter taste of snow, Russia, and subliminal flashes of cannon. Of course, Napoleon's invasion. The horses will be cut down in the forest. The camera moves among the trees, accompanied by the feathery hiss of the soundtrack. A mind guided and disembodied envisions horses on their backs, kicking. The birches seem to struggle to speak, and not to be used this way by the camera, by the political imagination. The stumbling movement, the impression of helplessness and crime. This is what he remembers. How he must always leave the theater and walk out to the street to put on the weight of lights like chains.
Yeah, lovely. Especially the last line again. Jodi, since Ben read another poem, I'm going to give you a chance to read another poem.
Okay. This one's called A Blind Hawk Visited by Schoolchildren. He flies all day in the dark. He turns his head and listens to them pass like clouds. Against his breast he feels, five-fingered, the tops of trees. He is wingless, small, but in the blue space of his heart, he could carry the sky on his back. There, he rises in slow circles, climbing ladders of wind. I found him trying to fly. After 2 weeks, the thrust of his wings held my hand aloft. I tossed him up. He fell, slapping the air around my head, the sky the color of feathers. When I was 10, I went into a green field and lay down in a furrow. I covered myself with grass and dirt and left only a white hole of sun. It rained stars on my forehead, coming through leaves in splashes. When the hawk fell, dark as a planet, I lifted my face to catch him.
Jodi, what sort of things does Ben tell you about a poem that help you?
I think really the most helpful thing he ever told me was write about things that I know about. Again, referring to the influence of reading great writers to a student, and coming in with a sort of preconceived idea of what poetry should be. Quite often you get very vague, very idealistic, very out of contact with the sort of things that you actually live through. And Ben really helped me to see that the actual everyday things that I live through are far more interesting than anything that I've read someplace else or live sort of vicariously. That if I can get in touch with what actually happens, that's the best thing.
Do you make a distinction between using the stuff of your life and the confessional poem? Either that question could be answered by either.
I sort of dislike that term, confessional poetry. I don't know. To me, it sort of reeks of National Enquirer or something like that. I think there's quite a difference between taking an event or a feeling that you've had and really getting to the heart of it and just confessing what's happened to you. I think that
it's probably a misnomer, but it is a general term for the Sylvia Plath and Sexton Lowell type poem, which is very personal.
Right. I understand how it's used. I guess I dislike calling it that.
It's maybe a bad word.
Right. Yeah. But yes, I certainly do think that there is a little bit of a difference.